As a result of these developments, the breadth and the depth of the changes in U.S. trade policy have become more fully apparent.
America has grown accustomed to considering itself the world's leading tourist destination. New York, Las Vegas, Miami, Los Angeles, national parks, Broadway, and Hollywood for decades. These names have been synonymous with luxury, freedom, and dreams. Millions of people from all over the world saved money to see the Statue of Liberty at least once, walk through Times Square, or try their luck at a Las Vegas casino. But today, in 2025, a disturbing reality lies behind the bright facade. The U.S. tourism industry is collapsing before our eyes.
And to these ends, the United States has announced a series of trade actions. Those began near the start of this year with the so-called IEEPA tariffs against Canada and Mexico based on U.S. concerns about the border and fentanyl trafficking.
Planes depart with half-empty cabins, airports are deserted, and city streets, which until recently were filled with the voices of foreigners, have become unusually quiet. Hotels are losing customers, restaurants are cutting back on hours, and small businesses are closing one after another. Official reports from Washington continue to talk about record numbers, billions of dollars in revenue, and a golden age of American tourism. But independent studies paint a different picture: a sharp drop in the number of foreign travelers and a rapid decline in their spending. Why are the figures so different? The answer lies in the fact that government statistics count everything, including domestic travel, by Americans and price increases caused by inflation. But the actual number of tourists from abroad, those who bring in the most money to hotels, shops, and restaurants, is declining rapidly. According to forecasts by international experts, this year alone, America will lose more than $12 billion due to a decline in spending by foreign visitors. Some studies even suggest the figure could be as high as $21 billion. For an economy that is accustomed to feeding off external flows, this is not just an alarm signal, it is the beginning of a collapse.
In fact, the average U.S. tariff rate on the world has jumped from just over 2% at the end of last year to almost 16%, 8 times higher. 16% currently.
Canadians, who for decades have been the most loyal neighbors and have come in their millions, are cutting their trips by a third. Europeans, French, and Germans are reducing their bookings by 17%. These people are not budget tourists. They are used to staying in the best hotels and spending money in the most expensive boutiques. Their absence is felt in Manhattan, on Rodeo Drive, and in the business districts of Seattle. The reasons? There are several. The strong dollar makes travel to the US too expensive. Political rhetoric and strict border measures create the impression that guests are not welcomed with open arms, but with suspicion and a cold reception. Add to this the competition. Spain, Japan, Mexico, and other countries are actively luring travelers away by offering them favorable conditions and a friendly atmosphere. The result is obvious. America is losing not only money but also status. What has been built over decades as the tourist's ultimate dream is now beginning to crumble. And the question is no longer, can the US maintain its leadership? The question now is, what will remain of America's tourism industry when the crisis reaches its lowest point?
Specifically, under the new U.S. approach, countries must now buy access to the world's largest economy through a combination of tariffs, investments, unilateral trade liberalization, and policy changes in their home markets.
Today, we will examine why a country that has always been considered a magnet for travelers is losing ground, what lies behind the official reports, and where this collapse will lead. The United States tourism industry is currently experiencing what many call a historic turning point. Just a few years ago, the country prided itself on ranking first in terms of the number of international visitors and tourism revenue. New York, Las Vegas, Florida, and California remained the focus of global tourist flows, and every second foreign traveler dreamed of walking through Manhattan, seeing Niagara Falls, or taking a photo at the Hollywood Walk of Fame at least once in their life. But now, behind the facade of official reports talking about the golden age of tourism, there is a deep crisis, the scale of which is beginning to astonish even the most skeptical analysts. According to independent researchers, the flow of international tourists to the US will fall by 8% in 2025, which in absolute terms is a loss of millions of people. For a country where every percentage point of decline in foreign spending costs about $2 billion, this is a catastrophic amount. However, the crisis is not only visible in dry statistics. At the level of everyday life, the picture is even bleaker. Las Vegas, where it is usually impossible to squeeze through the crowds of tourists in the summer, is showing a record drop in hotel occupancy this year. Hotels that have maintained 100% occupancy during the high season for years are now barely 60% full. Casinos are reporting a 20% drop in revenue compared to last year. Airports in major cities are witnessing unprecedented scenes. Planes are taking off with half-empty cabins, and terminals that used to be impossible to find a free seat in now look almost sterile. Journalists who visited Los Angeles Airport in June noted that the waiting rooms had a feeling of empty celebration. The infrastructure is top-notch, but there are fewer and fewer people willing to pay for a trip to America.
Those were quickly followed by reciprocal tariffs on every U.S. trade partner and very high sectoral tariffs applied globally on strategic industries, including steel, aluminum, autos, and copper.
The reasons for this collapse lie in both economic and political spheres. The strong dollar makes travel to the US prohibitively expensive for many foreigners. 5 years ago, a tourist from Canada or Europe could afford a 2-week vacation in New York or Miami. But today the same expenses are 30% more expensive due to the difference in exchange rates. As a result, families who previously planned to travel to America now prefer Spain, Italy, or Japan, where their money goes further. But it is not only the exchange rate that plays a role. The perception of the country is also a key factor. Strict border checks, delays at airports, and reports of travelers having their phones and laptops confiscated for inspection create an image of an unfriendly and even hostile country. In global tourism, image plays no less a role than price, and it is precisely this image that America is rapidly losing today. Of particular importance is the fact that it is not only the federal budget that is suffering, but also ordinary people who depend on tourist flows. In New York, where tourism accounts for nearly 400,000 jobs, restaurants and shops have begun to lay off staff en masse. On Broadway, where it has always been sold out, ticket sales have fallen by 15%. Some theaters are closing their doors during the high season for the first time in decades. In Miami, small family-run hotels that relied exclusively on foreign guests are filing for bankruptcy one after another. Even large chains are reporting that they are forced to cut staff and abandon expansion plans. The situation is particularly dire for small towns and border areas, where tourism has always been the main source of income. In Montana and North Dakota, the decline in Canadian tourists has led to the closure of dozens of cafes and souvenir shops.
In a positive and very important development earlier this month, just a few weeks ago, the United States reaffirmed a core commitment to our free trade agreement, CUSMA, by reinforcing that those Canadian exports to the United States that are compliant with that agreement, that are compliant with CUSMA, will not be subject to U.S. IEEPA tariffs.
But even more alarming is that the crisis is systemic in nature. This is not just a temporary downturn linked to currency fluctuations or random political circumstances. This is a long-term trend, with the United States gradually losing its role as a tourist magnet. Competitors are acting aggressively. Spain and France are launching large-scale advertising campaigns. Japan is simplifying its visa regime, and Mexico is offering package tours that are almost half the price of American ones. As a result, millions of travelers who yesterday chose New York or Los Angeles are now buying tickets to Barcelona, Tokyo, or Cancun. And even worse for the US, these tourists are beginning to form new habits and loyalty to other destinations. In tourism, it is much more difficult to win back a lost customer than in any other sector of the economy. The economic consequences of this process are enormous. Tourism in America is not just entertainment for visitors. It represents 9 million jobs, more than $2 trillion in GDP, and billions in tax revenue. When this sector collapses, the entire chain suffers, from large corporations to small family businesses. Every 1% drop in international revenue means $2 billion in lost revenue for the economy. And if the forecasts of $21 billion in losses come true, the consequences will be comparable to a full-scale economic crisis affecting entire regions. Signs of panic are beginning to appear within the country. Tourism offices in major cities are urgently cutting budgets for international campaigns and shifting their efforts to attracting domestic travelers. But the domestic market is unable to fill the gaps left by foreign tourists. Americans are traveling more than before, but they are spending less. The average tourist from Europe spends twice as much money in the US as a domestic traveler. This means that even with an increase in domestic travel, the economy will still lose billions. Looking at the situation in terms of dynamics, it becomes clear that the crisis is only gaining momentum. Over the past 6 months, the number of international bookings has fallen by 10% compared to the same period last year. According to some airlines, ticket sales from Europe to the US have fallen to early 2000s levels. In Canada, the decline in travel to the US has reached 30%, and experts believe that this figure could grow even more if the political differences between the two countries are not resolved.
This new U.S. trade policy has several motivations: to raise tariff revenues, to protect strategic industries, to encourage foreign investment in the United States, and to change trade and non-trade policy in U.S. partners.
All these facts add up to a picture that looks like the beginning of a full-scale crisis. America is losing its position on the world tourism map. Cities, industries, and people who lived off tourism are facing a harsh reality. The flow of income is drying up, and with it, confidence in the future is disappearing. The government is trying to smooth things over with nice reports and loud statements, but on the ground, the situation speaks for itself. And if urgent measures are not taken, the US tourism industry could experience a collapse of truly historic proportions in the coming years. The reasons for the rapid decline in tourist traffic to the US are not a random set of circumstances, but a complex of factors that are intertwined and create a domino effect. At the heart of it are politics, economics, and how foreigners perceive the country. And while the overall decline in travel and billions in losses have already been discussed, a closer look at the specific reasons and geography of the decline makes it clear that the situation is much more serious than it seems at first glance. The main blow to the attractiveness of the US is the strong dollar. Over the past 2 years, its exchange rate against the euro and the Canadian dollar has risen so much that many families from Europe and Canada are simply abandoning the idea of traveling to America. For them, what used to be a week's vacation in New York or Miami now costs as much as a whole month of living at home. But the problem is not just the cost of flights and hotels. Every aspect of staying in the country, food, transportation, entertainment automatically becomes more expensive. Foreigners feel this immediately. The average restaurant bill, which seems reasonable to an American, becomes an unaffordable luxury for a Canadian or French person. The exchange rate itself could be a temporary problem, but it is exacerbated by strict immigration policies. There are increasing reports of visitors having their documents detained, their luggage thoroughly searched, or even their gadgets confiscated for inspection at the borders. Reports of foreigners being questioned for hours without explanation are spreading across social media and news channels. Even if these are isolated incidents, their impact on the image of the United States is enormous. Tourists want to feel safe and comfortable, not tense and suspicious of border guards. The situation is exacerbated by political statements from Washington that sound aggressive and demonstrate closed-mindedness instead of hospitality.
The United States has also imposed substantial trade actions on the Canadian lumber industry. Now, in recent weeks, the United States has agreed a series of trade deals with a variety of countries. And these deals have several aspects in common. First, baseline tariffs that cover a broad range of goods and services that are substantially higher than those U.S. tariffs that existed before.
Added to this is the rise in domestic crime in large cities, which is actively reported by the world media. In Europe and Asia, articles are published about how New York, Chicago, and San Francisco are becoming unsafe for tourists. Even if the level of real threat is not so great, the image that is formed is extremely negative. For many travelers, America is beginning to be associated not with culture and entertainment, but with risk, stress, and unpredictability. Competition is a particularly important factor. Other countries are acting as aggressively as possible against the backdrop of the American crisis. Japan recently adopted a package of measures that simplified visa procedures for Europeans and Canadians and launched subsidies for airlines to reduce ticket prices. Spain has invested millions of euros in promoting its resorts and cities, and this summer the number of tourists there has already grown by a record 12%. Even Mexico, which has always been considered a more budget-friendly destination, has managed to capture a share of the market by offering premium travel packages at half the price of similar programs in the US. Once tourists get used to new destinations, it becomes almost impossible to get them to return. A traveler who went to Tokyo or Barcelona for the first time and had a positive experience there is more likely to return there in the future than to risk spending a lot of money and nerves on a trip to New York again. This is exactly what is happening now. A new habit is forming among global tourists, in which America is taking an increasingly modest place. The geography of the decline in tourism in the US clearly shows the scale of the crisis. Canada, the closest neighbor and one of the most stable sources of tourists, is showing an alarming decline. According to official data, the number of trips across the land border has fallen by almost a third, and the number of flights from Toronto and Vancouver has decreased by more than 13%. But behind these figures lie far more dramatic consequences. In border states such as Montana, North Dakota, and Washington, entire cities depended on the flow of Canadians. Shops, restaurants, and even gas stations catered specifically to them. Today, these businesses are emptying, and owners admit that they do not know how they will survive the next season. In some places, revenues have fallen by 40%, a figure that is close to fatal for small businesses.
As in previous trade disputes, Canada has implemented a series of retaliatory tariffs. Their objectives have been to protect Canadian workers and businesses and to incentivize a negotiated settlement with the United States. Few other countries followed suit.
Europe is also gradually turning away from America. Tourists from Germany and France have traditionally been considered among the most desirable guests. They spent more than average, stayed in expensive hotels, and left substantial amounts of money in shops and restaurants. But recent reports show that the number of European visits has fallen by 17%. For New York, this is a disaster. It was Europeans who filled the luxury hotels in Manhattan and created the main flow of shoppers in Fifth Avenue boutiques. Now these establishments are seeing a sharp decline in sales, and some brands are considering closing stores due to falling profitability. The situation in Western cities is no better. Seattle expects international arrivals to drop by more than 26%. Portland is preparing for an 18% decline, and Detroit for a 17% decline. These figures mean not only empty hotels but also job losses. In Seattle, for example, a large restaurant chain has already closed 2 branches, stating that the flow of tourists no longer ensures their profitability. In Portland, the municipality has announced a budget deficit as tax revenues from tourism have fallen sharply.
Those trade deals with other countries also have limited or no relief from those sectoral tariffs in those strategic industries such as steel and autos. They include substantial commitments by the U.S. trade partners for investments in the United States and significant unilateral trade liberalization measures by U.S. trade partners.
The situation in New York is particularly telling. The city, which for many years was considered the crown jewel of American tourism, has seen a 17% drop in the number of foreign visitors. This is a blow not only to hotels and restaurants, but also to the cultural industry. Broadway, museums, and concert venues are losing a significant portion of their audience. For a city where tourism brings in billions in tax revenue, this situation could turn into a financial crisis affecting an entire sector of the economy. The crisis is not limited to border areas or individual megacities. It is nationwide, and trends indicate that the situation will worsen. Forecasts indicate that by 2026, the decline in international visits could exceed 10%. At that point, it will no longer be a temporary problem, but a profound structural restructuring of the tourism market, in which the US will lose its leading position for many years to come. All this data clearly shows that the causes and geography of the decline in tourism in the US are closely linked and reinforce each other. The strong dollar makes travel expensive, strict border policies create an image of an unfriendly country, and international competitors are actively exploiting the situation to their advantage. Canada and Europe, once the most reliable sources of tourists, are now experiencing a massive outflow. As a result, the economies of entire cities and states are collapsing, and the United States risks losing its status as one of the world's top tourist destinations. Today, as America faces its deepest tourism slump in decades, its competitors are acting with remarkable speed and determination. While Washington continues to debate whether the current crisis is a temporary blip or a systemic problem, other countries are already developing strategies that allow them to lure millions of tourists and secure long-term advantages. Europe, Asia, and Latin America are literally tearing the American pie apart. And in this competition, the US is increasingly finding itself playing catch-up. In 2025, Spain officially reported record numbers of foreign tourists, exceeding 90 million. Some of these visitors are the very Europeans who until recently chose New York or Miami. The secret of Spain's success lies in its simplicity and openness, cheap tickets, convenient visa procedures, and an aggressive advertising campaign that presents the country as a safe and friendly place to vacation. But most importantly, Spain is actively playing in a field where America has weakened cultural and gastronomic tourism. Instead of competing only with beaches, the Spanish are focusing on museums, festivals, and food tours, creating an alternative to New York and Chicago.